Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. The Vietnam War ended 50 years ago, yet it remains a polarizing moment in American history. Over the years, hundreds of books have been written about the conflict and its participants. But one recently published book offers new insight into one of the most infamous men of the war, Robert McNamara. Authors Philip and William Taubman explore the life and psyche of the former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in McNamara at War, A New History. Philip Taubman is affiliated with Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He previously worked at the New York Times for nearly 30 years, where he served as a Washington correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, deputy editorial page editor, and Washington bureau chief. Dr. William Taubman is a trained political scientist and former professor of political science, where he taught the subject at Amherst College. As you'll hear during our conversation, Dr. Taubman has written several books, including Stalin's American Policy. I sat down with Dr. Taubman to discuss his latest effort and what we can learn from the life and legacy of Robert McNamara. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. With me today is Dr. William Taubman. He is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College and is also the author of several books, including the topic of our conversation today, McNamara at War, A New History, which he co-wrote with his brother, Philip Taubman. Welcome, Dr. Taubman.
Hello, glad to be here.
So happy to have you. So let's dive right into this fantastic book. What prompted you to write a biography of Robert McNamara?
Well, my field in my career has really been Russian studies. I've taught political science at Amherst and specialized in Russian affairs and wrote two biographies, one of Nikita Khrushchev, which won a Pulitzer Prize, if I may say immodestly, and another one of Gorbachev. And then, frankly, I ran out of Russian leaders I wanted to write about. Plus, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I decided it was not safe to go there anymore.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure what to do next. And then my brother approached me with this suggestion. He, after a career at the New York Times as an editor and a correspondent, had moved to Stanford, where he graduated as an undergraduate. And while out there, he was approached by some old friends of McNamara asking if he would do a new book about Bob McNamara. He wasn't sure. He approached me and said, "Would you do it with me?" And I said, yes. So off we went. Happily ever after, I must say.
Well, it is a fantastic book and very well put together. And so I'm curious, you spend a lot of time investigating McNamara's early career and early life. So how did McNamara's relationship with his mother influence his personality and career trajectory?
Well, I believe that his relationship with his mother and his father had a profound effect on his life and his career. His mother was the kind of woman I would describe as a helicopter parent in a pre-helicopter age. She was a dominant figure in their family. She practically worshipped her son, Bob. She thought he was the most brilliant kid she'd ever seen. She thought he would have a brilliant career, a wonderful life, and she pushed him relentlessly in that direction, not just at home, but even when he went to Berkeley. She became a member of the fraternity Mothers Committee at the fraternity he joined. She followed his career at Harvard Business School. Even during World War II, she bombarded him with letters saying, "Why don't you write to me more? You have a divine future ahead of you." So she was a highly emotional woman, and it turned out, and this is something we could talk about some more, that he too was a highly emotional man, even though he seemed often to the world to be what Senator Barry Goldwater called a computer with legs, a cold fish, but he really wasn't. Now, a couple of other things about his mother. Not only did she push him and brag about him endlessly, but she told stories about him which weren't even true. In other words, she lied on his behalf. All the while, she was pressing him to have the highest standards of rectitude. She wanted him not only to be a brilliant man, but to be an honest man and to tell the truth when she herself did not. So she was a kind of model for him in a way that I think helps to explain his drive for excellence and power, his overweening ambition. Now, his father, if I can move to his father briefly, his father was a cold fish, very distant, aloof, a kind of disciplinarian when he chose to be so. So that in a way you could trace his mother's emotionalism and his father's aloofness into his own character, and you can see them reflected in him and his behavior.
And some of the things that you explore are perhaps maybe understudied or undercovered moments of McNamara's life. And you argue that his experience in Guam is something that deserves greater attention. So can you talk about what happened in Guam and how did that impact McNamara's later decisions?
Well, during World War II, McNamara was pulled out of Harvard Business School, where he had become an instructor, and he had become a numbers man. He had become a specialist in sort of going through all the numbers that a business would produce and judging its effectiveness in terms of those numbers. And in the military, he tried to do and succeeded in doing the same thing for the Air Force, or at least the 8th Air Force, to which he was attached. That is, the Air Force was highly disorganized when he joined, and he and the others, like him, pulled from Harvard, began to work on its logistics. How many planes did they have? How many sorties did the planes fly? How many targets did the planes destroy in flying their sorties? Guam, toward the very end of the war, he found himself helping General Curtis LeMay, who was the big boss of the Air Force, or at least the 8th Air Force, I think it was then. And one of the things LeMay was doing was getting ready to bomb Tokyo. And McNamara helped to convince him that in order to do the most damage, planes which were used to flying at 20,000 feet should go in at just, say, 7,000 feet to have a better look at what they were bombing. And what they succeeded in doing, and I put a quote around succeeded in doing, was in one night, they firebombed Tokyo and they killed as many as 100,000 citizens of Tokyo, most of them civilians. This is as many people as were killed by the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. No atomic bomb here, but just endless napalm inundating Tokyo and killing all those people. Now, this was something that after the war, the general himself admitted was, in effect, a war crime. Curtis LeMay said it was, in effect, a war crime, and McNamara felt it was too. But of course, it was a war crime achieved in the middle of a good war against a bad enemy, and so they were never charged with a war crime. But it was a part of the source of the guilt that McNamara carried around with him, which then arose again during the Vietnam War and helps to explain why this man who appeared to be a cold war hawk was actually a man torn by guilt and tormented by himself, by his own guilt. And that's why one of the things we say in the book is that he fought a war not only in Vietnam, but he fought a war with himself about his own achievements or lack thereof. We quote him in the book as saying things like, "I'm a son of a bitch," or "I owe an explanation to the thousands of people I killed." And this was the sort of secret of McNamara's psyche. He led, in fact, a kind of double life. He was a proponent of the war in Vietnam. He was the manager of the war in Vietnam, but he felt torn by a deep sense of guilt for his own role in Vietnam.
Yeah, and I think one of the strongest points of this book, and I think it was the intent behind the book, is it's the exploration of the emotional side to McNamara and trying to understand the psychological pieces of him and the relationships that he developed. And so if we could pivot a little bit to his relationships, and can you talk about his relationship with somebody like President Kennedy?
Well, his relationship with President Kennedy was really ideal. President Kennedy was a man he came greatly to respect and to admire, both for the way he performed, that is, Kennedy did, but also for his background. Kennedy had met with royalty. He'd met with prime ministers and presidents. He traveled the world. He even had been in Vietnam in the 50s. He respected McNamara. McNamara respected him. It was an ideal relationship, which is not true of his relationship with Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson.
Which I have. I do want to cover that question here in a minute. But one of the other kind of transformative things about McNamara working with Kennedy is his decision and his necessity to come and live in D.C. So how did living in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, change McNamara?
McNamara had been, before he came to Washington, he had worked his way up to become president of the Ford Motor Company. He'd started working for them in 1945-46, and early in 1960, he became the first president of the Ford Motor Company who was not himself named Ford. This was an amazing achievement. Yeah. But it was very interesting to discover that even while McNamara was a scintillating success as the president of Ford Motor Company, he chose not to live near Ford in Dearborn, where all the other Ford executives lived, and many General Motors executives lived too. He chose to live in Ann Arbor, the home of the University of Michigan. And he did that because he didn't want to be part of the bureaucracy, even as he headed it. Well, when he was called to Washington by Kennedy and he agreed to go, he did so on the condition, as he told Kennedy, that he would be a working Secretary of Defense rather than a socializing Secretary of Defense. And that meant that he did not want to be caught up in the Washington social life. He wanted to do his work on his own and be separate. He chose not to live in Georgetown, which is the area of Washington where many, many politicians and officials lived. But what happened in Washington was he got caught up in the Washington social life, in the Georgetown set, as it was called by people who've written about it. And in a way, this is something that I came up with, but it sounds alarming. Washington corrupted McNamara. That is, it engaged him, it entrapped him in all the goings-on. He became a regular at Bobby Kennedy's estate outside of Washington in Virginia. He played touch football on the grounds of that estate with the kids, of whom Bobby Kennedy had 11 or 12 of them. He played games in Bobby Kennedy's pool. He attended seminars, quote unquote, that Bobby Kennedy put on for officials. And he even got caught up eventually in what you might call Washington's sexual games. Not immediately, not clearly. It's complicated to talk about. And it's important to say that McNamara was devoted to his wife. But in the end, even before, she got sick, but even as she was still alive, but not in good shape, he was already beginning to consort with another woman. And we talk about that in the book.
Well, and another relationship that I found very fascinating and nuanced and complex was his relationship with First Lady Jackie Kennedy. And so I'm curious if you would speak a little bit about what that relationship was like and how did it evolve after President Kennedy passed away?
Well, even before President Kennedy was assassinated, that is in 1961-62, McNamara would attend parties at the White House, and it was noticed that on one occasion he was doing the twist, that dance with Jacqueline Kennedy. Uh, and they got to like each other a lot. She respected him a great deal. And we speculate that one reason she respected him so much was that he seemed to her to be a kind of model of sobriety, of seriousness, a man devoted to his wife, unlike President Kennedy, who was a womanizer. And so Jackie and Bob McNamara became good friends as long as Kennedy was alive. After President Kennedy was assassinated, he comforted her. He tried to protect her. He offered to buy her a home in Washington where she could live. She so respected him that she began to think of him as someone who could be a kind of model for her son, John.
Right.
A male figure on whom he was just a toddler at that point, but whom he could model himself as he grew up. And they became closer and closer, and he began to visit her in New York, where she had an apartment at times when his own wife was out of town in Washington. And she turned out to have a political influence on him because she was passionately against the war in Vietnam. And she would preach that point of view to him, even as he managed the war in Vietnam. And there was one evening where she describes in his memoirs in which she was so angry about the war that she beat his chest. She pounded her fists on his chest, begging him to stop the war and get out of Vietnam. And one of the great ironies of all this, we discovered, was that that's exactly what he wanted to do. Because beginning as early as 1965, he concluded the war was unwinnable and that the United States should get out, but he never told that in so many words to President Johnson. And that was one of the things that he felt so guilty about.
And I think this book also highlights, there's these relationships that were very important and influential for McNamara. And then there's also some pivotal events in his life that kind of shaped his decision-making and how he decides to approach his work. And one of the things that your book goes into so beautifully is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So can you talk about McNamara's time as Secretary of Defense and the Cuban Missile Crisis and kind of what impact that had on him?
The Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course took place in October 1962, was one of the earliest crises that McNamara confronted before Vietnam really ripened to the point where it was the major crisis. And in the crisis in Cuba, McNamara was on the whole a sensible, calm voice at a time when other people around President Kennedy were urging him to bomb the Russian missile sites in Cuba and to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. And McNamara, in contrast, was urging a naval blockade of Cuba to sort of stop the rush toward war. And this is precisely what Kennedy did. And it gave them time, him and Khrushchev, to work out a solution to the crisis without bombing the sites and without invading the island. Now, to be sure, before that happened, the United States did prepare to invade the island, and McNamara was in charge of that mobilization. So if you look at certain moments during the crisis, like the ones I just mentioned, when he's mobilizing the force to invade the island, if indeed that were to happen, it looks as if he was pushing for war. But overall, he was not. And overall, he was restraining the United States at a time when people like General Curtis LeMay, the man he had worked for in Guam, was pushing for an invasion. Now, it turned out, as McNamara and the world learned later, that the Soviets had placed in Cuba not only medium-range missiles capable of reaching the United States, but battlefield nuclear weapons, which probably would have been used against American forces invading Cuba had we done so. And where that would have led, nobody knows. But it was certainly possible that if the Soviets had used nuclear weapons to kill American invaders of Cuba, that we might have used nuclear weapons somewhere else. In other words, there was a real chance of a nuclear war. And when McNamara learned this, he was, many years later, at a conferences on the Cuban crisis, which actually I attended some of them. When McNamara learned this, he was aghast. Yeah. And it underlined for him the danger which he had always known was there, but never realized we had come that close to an actual nuclear war.
And you build this book up to really dive into Vietnam and McNamara's relationships with the leaders in facilitating this war and trying to figure out a way to win a quote-unquote unwinnable war. So how did the transition from President Kennedy to President Johnson influence McNamara and his handling of the war at Vietnam?
Well, the first thing to notice about that is that Kennedy, just before his assassination, had decided that it was probably time to get out of Vietnam, that we weren't doing very well there, that the war might be unwinnable, and that we had a good excuse. The excuse was that if the Vietnamese couldn't win it for themselves, then why should we win it for them? And they had tentatively decided to reduce the number of advisors we had. At that point, we did not have ground troops there, and to set as a tentative date the end of 1965 for possibly pulling out. Now, this was precisely what a year later in 1965, McNamara wanted to do. But in the meantime, Kennedy had been killed, Johnson had come in, and, well, looking back at Kennedy, we were not even sure that Kennedy would have kept to his own promise to pull out, because he had insisted that he wouldn't pull out until he was reelected. That is, he thought if he pulled out before the election, he might lose the election. Yeah. He thought that the real threat to him politically in the United States was not the anti-war group, which was not even very large at that point. It was the right wing who would accuse him of having lost Vietnam. Well, that's precisely the fear that Johnson had, that he would look like the guy who lost Vietnam. And we discovered, looking back at Johnson's record, which included reading his telephone or listening to his telephone conversations with people and reading declassified documents, that Johnson was deeply torn about Vietnam. Half the time he thought it was a hellhole and we would never be able to get out with honor. Half the time he thought we've got to win or he would look terrible as a president. He was afraid that all of his social programs, his civil rights programs, which he cared about so much, would never make it through a Congress if Congress blamed him for the loss of Vietnam. So Johnson was torn, but in the end, he wanted to fight and wanted to win. And what McNamara did was follow what Johnson wanted. We came across this very revealing quote, which relates to this point. One of McNamara's co-instructors at Harvard Business School, who later became McNamara's Secretary of the Air Force, said later, and this is a paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me, but he said, McNamara is never more certain and never more strongly in favor of an idea that when the idea he is in favor of is something that his boss wants him to fight for, even though he himself, McNamara, is against it. So that sort of summarizes McNamara's sense that if Johnson wants this war won, we must fight it and try to win.
Yeah. And you touched on this earlier in your answer, but I do want to ask, how was McNamara's relationship with Johnson different from that with Kennedy?
Yes. Well, I don't think McNamara respected Johnson's knowledge of the world. He respected him greatly as a kind of paramount politician. You know, he figured Johnson understood Congress better than anybody. Johnson knew how to talk to people, to voters, as well as or better than anybody. But that Johnson was not a man who knew the world anywhere nearly as well as Kennedy did. But beyond that, and here's the psychological element, we discovered by reading very carefully Robert Caro's magnificent 4 volumes of a biography of Johnson, that Johnson was a manic depressive. You know, if you watched him coming on to congressmen and grabbing them by the lapels and demanding that they support him, and he was manic. But we learned from reading closely Caro and others that periodically Johnson would get so depressed that he would fall into his bed, put pillows over his face, and not come out until his wife, Lady Bird, begged him to do so. And that furthermore, most of these episodes occurred at a time when his political future was uncertain or even unlikely. Well, how does this relate to McNamara? We decided that to a man like Johnson, who was so torn in his views and so vulnerable in his psychology, a man like McNamara, who was so ultra efficient and seemingly super confident, was the perfect person to rely on. And that's what he did. When we looked closely at their relationship, we discovered, with the help of Lady Bird's diary, that Johnson depended on McNamara. I mean, he would say to Lady Bird, whenever McNamara's out of the country, I can't sleep. Until he comes back, I worry, that he won't come back. I desperately need him. And we also discovered that Johnson cultivated McNamara. He would, even more than a president would ordinarily, a Secretary of Defense, McNamara would be home with his family, getting ready to grill hamburgers, say, for picnic lunch on a weekend. And suddenly Johnson would call up from the White House and say, you get over here, Bob, and bring your family, and we'll give you lunch here. And McNamara would drop everything and hurry over to the White House. So that McNamara, this dependence of Johnson on McNamara, increased McNamara's importance in the White House and also buttressed McNamara's own sense of self-esteem. So this was a kind of psychological feedback mechanism here. Johnson desperately needs McNamara. Johnson cultivates McNamara. McNamara needs Johnson both politically and psychologically. Very complicated relationship, but I think very important to understanding their relationship.
Yeah. And I think that might feed into the next question that I have, which is, why do you think McNamara kept pushing for this war when he secretly harbored doubts about its chances of success?
Well, McNamara, either then or later on, voiced certain convictions of his, which helped to explain his behavior. For example, he believed that his highest obligation as a member of Johnson's cabinet was to support the president and the presidency. Whereas we point out in the book, his oath of office, that is McNamara's oath of office, pledged him not to support the president, but to support and defend the Constitution. So that's one conviction that helps to explain his behavior. Another was that he had such respect for what Johnson was doing in civil rights and the war on poverty, so that he could feel that even if the war in Vietnam wasn't going well, what Johnson was doing domestically was so important for the country that he needed to be helped to stay in power. Those are just, well, and another one was Johnson's own fear that if he lost Vietnam, that he would be discredited and the Democratic Party would be discredited and many of the things that McNamara was trying to accomplish would be discredited. But and another thing, and this is important, although McNamara came slowly to question the domino theory was that if Vietnam falls, Southeast Asia will fall to the communists. And if Southeast Asia falls to the communists, then Japan will eventually fall to the communists. And if all of Asia, including Japan, falls, then Europe will be isolated and vulnerable. So, in other words, even as McNamara felt the war was unwinnable, he wasn't absolutely sure that the war fighters were wrong when they insisted that that war be won. So these are all convictions that he had. But then we get back to the psychological. That is to say, he felt that Johnson needed to be supported. He himself was insecure about some of his own role and some of his own feelings. And so he just wasn't prepared to go into Johnson's office and tell him to his face, this war is losing. We're losing this war. We've got to get out, pull out. The political convictions and the psychological manifestations or the psychological complexities all added up to his deciding to stay in office, as it happened until early 1968, which is 3 years after he concluded the war was unwinnable, managing the war, trying where possible to slow it down, resisting the efforts of the military to speed it up, to escalate it, trying to start negotiations with the North Vietnamese, which might end the war, but not doing the thing he most wanted to do, which is telling Johnson, you got to get out.
And one of the things the book highlights is McNamara's ability to kind of compartmentalize and separate his professional life and his personal life. So how did his work at the Pentagon during Vietnam impact his family life?
It really almost ruined his family life. His wife eventually died in 1981 of cancer, and he attributed her failing health to Vietnam, to all the tension that Vietnam had created, not only in him, but in the entire family. The most fraught relationship in the family was with his son, Craig, who was born in 1950. There were 2 daughters, too, Margie, who was born in 1941, and Kathleen, who was born in 1944. But Craig was born in 1950, and he eventually turned against the war himself, at which McNamara only discovered when one day he looked into his son's bedroom and found there was a huge poster of the American flag turned upside down on the wall. Craig became an opponent of the war, and McNamara didn't know how to handle that. At one point, Craig, when he was, I believe, in high school, prep school, wrote to his father, I want to make arguments against the war, but I need to know more about the arguments for the war. Can you please send me the reasons why we are fighting the war? McNamara never answered that plea, never sent him that material. McNamara helped him get into Berkeley, where McNamara, had gone. There, Craig became even more radicalized. McNamara sort of cut him off at that point, and Craig decided he couldn't take it anymore in the United States, and so he fled on a motorcycle and a ship along the way to South America, all the way down to the tip of South America, Easter Island, where he worked for a year on a dairy farm. He cut himself off from his family. And at one point in his escape to Latin America, he found himself, I think it was in Buenos Aires, where McNamara, his father, was giving a speech. And McNamara did not reach out to him, not even sure McNamara knew where he was. Craig did not reach out to his father. Their relationship became fractured, broken. Craig McNamara's mother, Bob McNamara's wife, was wounded by all of this. She made her way all the way down to Easter Island. She begged her son to come back and promised that her husband, his father, would try to get along better with him. And Bob and Craig eventually went back, and Craig insists that once he got back, things became better with his father. His father, for example, helped to finance a walnut farm in California, which Craig took over and ran as a farmer and still does to this very day. And eventually, they had a kind of reconciliation, but quite recently, Craig wrote a book about their estrangement, which has the title, Because Our Fathers Lied. Now, his relationship with his daughters was better. I don't know as much about those. We talked to Margie, but not very much to Kathleen. But still, the family was fractured, and this therefore added to McNamara's sense of estrangement from his family, or from his son at least, and probably to his sense of guilt for having played whatever role he did in the alienation of his son. We even found a reflection of this in the architecture, in the layout of their home in Washington, D.C., in which McNamara apparently could spend all of his time in the evening in his study, working on the work that he brought home from the Defense Department. And that work and his concerns about it, he kept from his family. Mm. Maybe not as much from his wife, but certainly from his children. So in that sense, he compartmentalized his life. He kept his work. He kept his worries. He kept his feeling of torment from them to try to protect them. But of course, how did they take it? Right. They took it as he was distancing himself from them.
And so you mentioned earlier in one of your responses that McNamara does eventually leave the administration. So what prompted him to move to the World Bank, and how did this tie into his kind of lifelong mission of wanting to help people on a worldwide scale?
First of all, McNamara he did say, that he was not sure whether he resigned from the Pentagon or was fired. And that's because what happened eventually was he was approached by the then president of the World Bank and asked if he would be interested in becoming its president. And he said, well, I don't know, I might be interested, but this is entirely up to Johnson, President Johnson. And when Johnson heard about this, he seized this opportunity, in effect, to get rid of McNamara and to appoint him, indeed, president of the World Bank. The reason Johnson could do this was the United States was the biggest contributor to the World Bank, and therefore, by tradition, got to nominate the president of the World Bank. Now, Johnson did this with a divided heart, because he, by that point, understood that McNamara was beset by all the conflicts in his life, and that his health was deteriorating, and that he was driving himself, into perhaps even an illness. So in moving Johnson moving McNamara to the World Bank, Johnson felt he was helping McNamara to get out from under all the pressure he was under at the Pentagon. But at the same time, Johnson was protecting himself, because one of the rules at the World Bank was the World Bank president or anybody else at the World Bank does not criticize the country that he comes from. So what he was doing was he was protecting himself, Johnson was, from McNamara's being able to criticize the war or Johnson from his new position at the World Bank. But as you said, the other element of this is that the World Bank was, in a sense, the ideal job for McNamara, because he had always wanted to help people. And he had even toyed with the idea, after he went to Harvard Business School, of changing his career path and going back to medical school. He had an old friend from California, where they both grew up, who was at medical school and had become a doctor. And McNamara explained to his friend that it wasn't so much that he wanted to help individual patients. He wanted to help people in the world on a international scale as some kind of major figure in world health. So suddenly there he was at the World Bank with precisely that mandate. And we have evidence we interviewed people who had worked with him at the World Bank. We studied his record at the World Bank, and we discovered that, for example, he took on the plague of river blindness, which is a disease that blinded people infected in certain parts of Africa by flies that carried the germ, the virus, whatever it was. This had been ignored by the World Bank, And McNamara set up a special program to attack river blindness, having seen the all awful sight of line of grown-up men being led along a riverbank, holding onto a rope and being led along by boys who could see when the older men could not. So it was a wonderful time. It was also wonderful because Mrs. McNamara, Bob McNamara's wife, was included. She went on most of his trips to Africa and elsewhere where she had been excluded from Vietnam as part of his compartmentalization of his life. So it was a wonderful time for them. But then she got sick and she died just about the time he left the World Bank. And so suddenly that wonderful job was over. His wonderful wife was gone, and he had to cope with his remaining years, of which there were, 28 years more.
Yeah.
Because he left the job in 81 and he didn't die until 2009. He had to cope with this on his own.
And stepping back a little bit and trying to have a broader lens, how does learning about McNamara help us understand our current moment?
Well, it doesn't take much imagination to realize that, especially if you're not a great admirer of our current president, that there are going to be, or there already have been, decisions which are highly controversial and about which, at least we know in Trump's first administration, members of his administration had grave doubts. And what some of them did was resign. And even if they didn't resign with a quote unquote howl of protest, it was pretty clear that they were unhappy with what Trump was doing. And as we also know, in his second term, Trump has seemed to make sure that he's surrounded by people who won't do that to him, who will stay on even if they don't like what he's doing. And it's not clear that they won't like it either, because they're such fantastic loyalists to him and all of what he does. So in a sense, in that sense, McNamara could be a model for a cabinet member who loses faith in what his boss, the president, is doing and considers resigning. Well, the first question is anybody considering it in the Trump administration? My own guess, which is based on nothing, but observing his history and his body language and his facial expression, is that Marco Rubio might be such a person. He had an independent position. He was quite critical of Trump for a long time. And yet there he is, staying on in the administration. I don't mean to be so political myself. I'm sorry if I offend Trump listeners of yours, pro-Trump listeners. But it seems to me McNamara is the classic example of a man who wrestles with the very question that I'm posing: what to do when your boss, the president of the United States, does something which you reject. Should you resign? Should you talk back? What should you do? Well, it seems to me that is precisely the problem that McNamara wrestled on.
And, kind of going beyond that, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
What I think, we're constantly observing people in Washington, politicians in and out of the administration, in Congress, and particularly people of that rank, presidents and members of the cabinet, of which McNamara was the star under both Kennedy and Johnson. And we see them, we hear them, we read about them endlessly, but we don't really know what's going on inside their head. And it seems to me what this book reveals is, in as much depth as we could manage and muster, is the struggle going on inside the head of Robert McNamara, the inner life, you might say, of the double life of a man who was both the proponent of the war and a secret opponent of the war. It's a very rare chance, I think, to penetrate the mind of somebody of that importance with that much impact on our lives and on the course of history. And there it is. Suddenly it was available, and we tried to convey it so that other people could see it.
And where should people go to learn about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I can tell you a little bit right here. As I'm an academic, I taught at Amherst. I taught Russian studies. I wrote biographies of Khrushchev and Gorbachev. I wrote another book about Stalin. I wrote one book with the support of my wife, co-author, about a year or a half a year we spent in Moscow in 1988 under Gorbachev, whom I later wrote a biography of. And in that book, which is called Moscow Spring, we took our family with us. And so it's a book about an American family coping with Moscow in 1988 and our adventures encountering Gorbachev, who seemed to be transforming the country, which we admired, but we were worried about whether he would succeed. And at the end, of course, he did for a while, but then it came crashing down. My brother, Phil, is a journalist, and he was writing for the New York Times for many years. He later became an editor at the Times, deputy editorial page editor. And at one point, he was actually in Moscow covering the Soviet Union when we were there doing research. My wife is a specialist on Russian language, literature, and film. So this combination of an academic and a journalist was a challenge. And I might just say a word about that. Your listeners might be interested. The difference is journalists are chasing the news. They want to report what's going on now. Of course, in the perspective of what's gone on before and where it might lead in the future, but they're after the news. As an academic, I was of course interested in the news, but I was always trying to provide perspective on it. And although my degree is in political science, I in effect became more of a historian and a biographer. So the question is, how would Phil and I, my brother and I, turn out to work together on this project? And I think it worked out well. That is, the two things we were interested in complemented each other. Phil was fascinated by the new material we were learning about McNamara and Jacqueline Kennedy, for example, trying to track down that relationship. I was, of course, interested in that too, but I was the one who concentrated on the earlier chapters about McNamara's childhood, his years in college, his years at Harvard Business School, his years in the military at Ford Motor Company. Phil then concentrated on the years at the Pentagon, and I picked up again at the World Bank, McNamara at the World Bank, and then the rest of his life. So, and were there any conflicts? Not really. And Phil had a funny way of describing how we could avoid conflicts. He said, Bill is 6.5 years older than I am. That is, I am. And therefore, I had seniority. And if we had any disagreements, my seniority would carry the day. Well, that's not. We really didn't have disagreements. And the odd thing is that our voices, that is, our writing styles, sort of work together. And I think it's going to be hard for people to judge who wrote which chapters, in part because we edited each other's chapters. And therefore brought the style of the book together.
Yeah, I definitely could not tell who wrote which chapter, so I think it was very well put together and very comprehensive. But before I let you go, is there anything we haven't covered that you want future readers to know?
I guess one of the things that is the psychology. I taught for 10 years at Amherst. I taught a course called Personality and Political Leadership with a professor of psychology. And I learned a lot about personality theory. And so in that sense, I'm not afraid to try to apply that and to understand the people I'm writing about. Whereas I know other people who write biographies steer away from that. because they don't feel they're qualified. Now, that doesn't mean this is a psychobiography, because I don't want to claim that, and I'm not really qualified to do it. And even if I tried to, my brother would stop me probably and say that's psychological speculation. But I think that among biographies that I know have read,
Yeah.
I think we are in this book a little more focused on psychology, both of McNamara and of Johnson, among others. And I think that readers might want to keep that in mind, for better or for worse, depending upon whether they like it or are put off by it.
Well, I thought it was a very interesting angle for which to tell the story, and had the right balance of kind of looking at what was there, but not stepping over the boundaries of trying to diagnose McNamara. So
Yeah.
well done for what it's worth.
Well, it's nice to hear that from somebody like you,
Thank you.
qualified to judge.
Well, so to all the listeners out there, I highly recommend picking up a copy of McNamara at War. Even if you think you know everything there is to know about Vietnam or the infamous Robert McNamara, I think you're going to walk away with a new understanding and insight to the man behind the legend. So thank you again, Dr. Taubman.
Thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed this chance to talk with you about the book.
My sincerest thanks to Dr. Taubman for spending his time with me. If you have any interest in the Vietnam War, then I highly recommend adding McNamara at War to your collection. It is an insightful read and one that I think provides a different perspective on the man behind the legend. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.